I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we bring you updates from the battlefront as Ukrainian forces hold the Russian advance near Vovchansk. A Russian armoured column is hit in Kursk, and we delve into the latest news and analysis around the Ukrainian economy.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
If we give President Zelensky the tools, the Ukrainians will finish the job. Slava Ukraini!
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Monday, the 3rd of June, 2 years and 101 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our associate editor Dominic Nicholls, assistant comment editor Francis Dearnley, and our guest is business editor at the Kyiv Independent, Liliane Bivings. I started by asking Dom for the latest news from Ukraine.
Quite a lot to get through today, so I'm afraid it's a bit of a mishmash, but I've tried to blob it into some sort of order. Let's start with Saturday. So Saturday, the White House confirmed that Ukraine cannot use US-supplied ATACMS missiles inside Russia. President Biden gave Ukraine permission to strike inside Russian territory with American munitions, but under certain conditions. So that was breaking at the end of last week. But a White House spokesperson on Saturday said this does not apply to ATACMS or long-range strikes. How you pass the two of those, I'm not entirely sure. The spokesperson continued, but it is designed to enable Ukraine to defend itself. So a little bit at odds, although a very clear shift in policy. Now, US permission only covers the area immediately to the north of the border and Kharkiv area, and that the oblast to the north of that, and only allows Ukraine to fire Himars at targets in Russia, not longer range missiles. Speaking to reporters yesterday from the Shangri-La dialogue, the defence conference in Singapore, we'll speak more of that a little bit later, President Zelensky said, I think that using any Western kind of weapon on the territory of Russia is a question of time. Otherwise, it is not about just peace. Now then, on Sunday, numerous Russian sources were saying that Ukraine has fired US-made weapons at targets inside Russia. The first time, well, possibly we think the first time it would have done so. Russia's MOD and a number of Russian military bloggers said that Himars were fired by Ukraine at Russia on Saturday evening. The sanctioned Russian war reporter and Kremlin propagandist Yevgeny Pobydy on his Telegram channel said the enemy has begun using Western-made weapon systems to attack old Russian territory. These are fragments of M142 Himars MLRS shells, almost as if he's just gone straight onto Wikipedia. Note the language there about old Russian territory. They're really trying to put a wedge there and make the difference between old territory and new territory, although as in Ukraine, they're trying to say Ukraine is new Russian territory, although quite how that argument stacks up against their position that it's always been the same, it's always been one Russia, I don't know, but you'll hear increasing references to old and new. Anyway, Mr. Pobudny continued. He said the Russian army's air defense crews destroyed more than 10 missiles in the sky over the Belgorod region. Ukraine has not commented. Don't know about that. We can't verify any of that. However, in Russia's Kursk Oblast, location, well, obviously over the border from Ukraine, there was a large Russian column of armoured vehicles destroyed on the move. So there's footage on social media. You can find it. It looks like 14 vehicles with first-person view drone that hit the number 2 and number 14. So not the very first vehicle, which it was probably aiming for. What you're trying to do on a vehicle move like that, if those vehicles, and these were wheeled Kamaz trucks by the looks of it, so not great cross-country mobility, but you're aiming to hit the first one and the last one so they can't go anywhere and then pick off the ones in the middle. So they didn't hit the first one, they seemed to hit the second one and the last one, but it still had the effect. There was pandemonium. The other vehicles tried to scatter across the muddy surface, didn't do very well, and a lot of them got wiped out. Now that, we think, was FPV, so not HIMARS, but it was definitely a strike inside Russia. So maybe all these things are being conflated. As I often say, it's very confusing, very difficult to get a clear line. So we try and put all the bits of information in front of you, try and make some sensible analysis of it. But largely we are grouping around in the dark. However, Next one. Today, Monday, the Russian military is said to have suffered 1,270 casualties in the last 24 hours. This comes from Ukraine's general staff. If so, that would be one of the highest numbers of daily Russian casualty figures since the start of the full-scale invasion. When we talk about casualties, we mean dead and wounded, missing and taken prisoner. But the vast majority of that figure would be dead and wounded. Ukraine's military regularly report Russian casualties of more than 1,000, or they did so throughout May. But if accurate, that would make May the most deadly for Moscow's forces since the start of, or since February 2022. Mostly taken up, I would suggest, by the whatever's happening up in Kyiv, offensive/diversion, whatever's going on up around Kyiv, and the numerous attempted pushes out of the Donbass, which, as I've said before, if the thing around Kyiv is a diversion, you'd expect the main attack to come somewhere. But the bit around Donbass has been so, unsuccessful, basically, that I can't tell if it was the main attack. But essentially, there's been a lot of attempted armoured assaults in the Donbass. They've all come to nothing. Casualties are very, very high, and hence that will probably make up for the fact that May seems to be the most deadly month for Russia's troops. Now, as I say, we can't independently verify any of these. However, Britain's Ministry of Defence they have said that Russian losses amounted to 1,200 on average per day throughout May. I mean, just a staggering figure. It's likely to have taken the total casualties of just killed and wounded over 500,000 since the start of the full-scale invasion. Now, speaking of the Donbass, Russia's MOD says it's captured a village in eastern Ukraine, says its forces are advancing, quote, in all tactical directions, which might mean they're scattering all over the place, but in all tactical directions, they say they're moving. Russia's MOD said the troops, quote, have managed to liberate the village of Umanskoye in the popular Republic of Donetsk. I don't know if that's a mistranslation from the site I took it from, if they meant the People's Republic. But anyway, Donetsk. Now, this village, Umanskoye, is about 25 k's northwest of Donetsk. And, it's not quite a mega city. It was home to about 180 people before the start of the full-scale invasion. Generally, though, not an awful lot of movement over the weekend. On the Kursk front, so kind of Donetsk city, northwest of there, Avdiivka, Russians are trying to push along that line to the northwest of Avdiivka. That reporting came from Ukrainian online newspaper Pravda. Elsewhere, a few more interesting bits and pieces to take note of, not geographically fixed. Greece says it has sent the first F-16 fighter jet instructor to Ukraine. This is coming from Greece's Defence Point website. They're reporting the first military or service personnel, NATO obviously, is inside Ukraine training, this one on F-16s. Ukrainian pilots, as we know, have been training on F-16s across Europe for the past 12 months, mainly in Romania and Denmark, not previously reported to have been in Ukraine. But the website says, this is Defence Point website, says the presence of the Greek airmen in the capital of Ukraine is apparently part of the F-16 Training Coalition initiative. That's an international coalition. Greek government has not commented on the report, but let's see NATO troops inside Ukraine. Let's see what happens now. I think we know what's going to happen. Okay, next one. 1.5 million military-age Ukrainian men have registered their personal data for potential conscription, Ukraine's defence ministry have announced. They say this news comes after the new mobilization law was enacted in May. That gives draft-eligible men 60 days to update their personal data so that the military authorities are able to find them if need be. The Ukrainian Ministry of Defence also said that 14,000 Ukrainian men living abroad had registered for service. Ukraine, you'll remember, suspended consular services for military-aged Ukrainian men living abroad in April. However, draft-eligible men are now able to apply for those services if they provide documentation and proof confirming that they have registered with the military. So that takes that on a little bit. Now then, I mentioned the Shangri-La dialogue. So you've got the IISS, the International Institute for Strategic Studies, a global think tank based here in London, but it runs a number of defence conferences. They call them dialogues. So you've got the Shangri-La dialogue that's happened this weekend, just gone in Singapore, and you've got the Manama dialogue based out of Bahrain. So they are global. The headlines are global. President Zelensky was there, US Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, but essentially they're quite regional in terms of the work they do. But you do get the glitzy big hitters to other keynotes and what have you. So they are global in scope, but the focus is quite regional. And actually, interestingly, IISS have said that they're going to launch a new one for kind of Euro-Atlantic focus in Prague this year. So 8th to the 10th of November this year, you're going to have the Prague dialogue, which we will go to. We had someone we've got Nicola at Shangri-La. She's filing for us today, so you'll get some news out of that. But I've got a few bits and bobs from it. Now, President Zelensky was at the Shangri-La dialogue, and in his speech, he accused Beijing of working with Moscow to undermine this month's peace summit, which is planned for the middle of the month in Switzerland. He said Russia is doing everything it can to disrupt the summit using Chinese influence and its diplomats. He was speaking to reporters on the sidelines of the Shangri-La dialogue. But earlier, he gave a keynote speech appealing for Asian leaders to join the summit, that's the peace summit in Switzerland, to help forge a path to end the war. He said, "We want Asia to know what's going on in Ukraine. We need the support of Asian countries. It is much needed. Russia, using Chinese influence in the region, using Chinese diplomats also, does everything to disrupt the peace summit." China later denied the accusation it was acting as a quote-unquote instrument of Russia by pressuring other countries not to attend the peace summit. And in a statement, Beijing's foreign ministry said, quote, "China's position is open and transparent, and there is absolutely no instance of us putting pressure on other countries," end of quote. Right, the Philippine Coast Guard might have something to say about that, but that's what Beijing's foreign ministry says. Now, Swiss authorities had hoped China would attend the peace conference, but Beijing says it's not going to do so without Russia being present. And the line at the moment is there's no point in inviting Russia because they're just not serious. They wouldn't go in good faith. Now, in another exchange at the Shangri-La dialogue, US Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, I mentioned he was there, in answering a question from a Chinese colonel, People's Liberation Army colonel, the point had been put to Lloyd Austin, that this Chinese colonel, that NATO expansion had led to the war in Ukraine. So Lloyd Austin then said, "I respectfully disagree with your point that the expansion of NATO led to the Ukraine crisis." He then had to stop because there was widespread applause for that statement across the forum. Now, it wasn't a Ukraine forum. It wasn't even in Europe. This is in Singapore. So mainly a lot of the attendees were from Asian countries, Indo-Pacific. So that's the focus. Widespread applause for that comment there by Secretary of Defense Austin. He then carried on. He said the Ukraine crisis was caused because Mr. Putin made a decision to unlawfully invade his neighbour, who had an inferior military at that point in time. He assumed that he could very quickly roll over his neighbour and annex the country. That was 2+ years ago. He has not achieved any of his strategic objectives to this point. So interesting. I think that's quite interesting, the response he got there from a mainly sort of Asian Indo-Pac audience. Also, so back at Shangri-La, President Zelensky, later, he formally recognised both Israel and Palestine. I think this is a very interesting intervention. President Zelensky said, Ukraine said that if Hamas terrorists attacked civilians on the first day of their attack on Israel, then Israel has the right to defend itself. And after that, when Israel was in Gaza and there was a humanitarian crisis, Ukraine said, firstly, we are ready to provide humanitarian aid to Gaza. Secondly, we must respect international law. Thirdly, Ukraine recognises two states, both Israel and Palestine, and will do everything it can to convince Israel to stop, to end this conflict, and to prevent the suffering of civilians. Now, Ukraine has invited both Israel and Palestine to that peace summit in Switzerland. But I think, look for comment here from you. What do you think about this? I think it's very interesting that President Zelensky comments and recognises, or comments so openly about Israel and Palestine, and recognises Palestine, because that is, as much as he's been very vocal in his support for Israel's right to act in self, I think given the nature of the conflict there and the politics around it, I thought that was a surprising intervention. But anyway, would be interested in your thoughts. And that was quite a bit of a whistle stop, David, but I think there were quite a few things happening over the weekend. We needed to scoot around a bit, but I will take a little pause there.
Well, thank you very much, Dom, for all of that. As you said, quite a few updates, and you did have to bring them all together. So thank you, Dom. Francis, can I come to you very quickly before we go to our guest? Francis Dearnley, where are you and what are you doing?
Well, bonjour, David. Francophile Francis is back with a vengeance. The beret's on and the onion necklace is around my neck. I'm in sunny Paris for a few hours, sadly not to hold Macron to account for all of his promises about Ukraine, not yet anyway, but whilst I wait to catch a train to Normandy, where I'm about to meet with the team behind the American charity Ukraine Focus, who are delivering ambulances to Ukraine. You'll hear a lot more about them over the coming days as I'm joining them for some of the journey across Europe, as well as the commemorative events they're taking part in for the D-Day 80th anniversary. President Biden is widely expected to fly in for the 6th of June, and President Zelensky too is rumoured to be making an appearance. Obviously, there's huge symbolic value for him, as well as meeting up with other Western leaders. There are lots of events taking place on the beaches, Gold, Sword, Juneau, Utah and Omaha, of course, and at the cemeteries. I'm hoping to be at the American cemetery on the 6th of June. I think Dom will be on Omaha. This will, of course, likely be the last major anniversary veterans will be alive for, which gives it a particular significance and power. We often, when thinking about D-Day, reflect very much on Omaha specifically because of the horrors that took place there, and obviously how well known the film Saving Private Ryan is with its opening scene. But actually the whole of the Normandy campaign was horrific. And if you don't believe me, just read Anthony Beevor's book D-Day, The Battle for Normandy, which just shows how troubling and challenging it was to break out from the beachheads. This idea that once the beaches were broken, it was all plain sailing from there is simply not true. It's a fantastic book and is as horrific in many ways as his most famous book, Stalingrad, is. So it's going to be quite a few days for me. No updates per se, I doubt, this week in terms of politics, although I did just want to comment on the fact, because Dom was talking about China there, one day maybe China will talk about Dom, but Dom was talking about China, it's been very interesting over the weekend seeing the apparent dispute between Moscow and Beijing over an oil pipeline that was meant to be oil and gas, I think, I need to look into this, but that was meant to be connecting in Siberia. And the fact is that this was one of the main things that Putin was pushing for behind the scenes with President Xi, particularly in that latest meeting between the two of them. But Beijing has rejected to go ahead with this. Now, they may well just be playing hardball for economic reasons, or quite possibly they are nervous about being seen as being too firmly economically aligned with Moscow at this moment. I lean towards the former rather than the latter. They think they can get more and squeeze more from Moscow, but nonetheless an interesting development. So that's where I am, David. It's going to be an interesting period, I think, and I'm hoping to be able to tune into as many as I can.
Well, thank you very much, Francis, for joining us. Best of luck with your reporting, and do send your interviews back and send your things back, and we'll try and get them up on the podcast. If you can stay around for the final thought, it'd be very interesting to hear a little bit more about your plans for the week. But let's go to our guest now, Liliane Bivings. Liliane, welcome back to the podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. Would you just start very quickly by reintroducing yourself to our listeners?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for having me back. Like you said, my name is Liliane Bivings. I'm the business editor at the Kyiv Independent, which many of you may know is Ukraine's largest English language news outlet.
Liliane, you've written a fantastic essay for the Telegraph that came out a few days ago, looking at the Ukrainian economy, premised on the question, what if Putin wins? Where did you start with your breakdown of the Ukrainian economy when you were approaching this question?
It's funny that you asked me this because, when I think about where I literally started, it was horrible writer's block that turned into literal panic and panic text messages to my dear editor, our editor-in-chief, Olga Rudenko, saying, I don't know how to write this story. This is really hard to imagine a totally hypothetical situation in which Putin wins. Of course, one that we don't want to imagine either. And what that would mean for the Ukrainian economy and the global economy. So she called me, of course, to calm me down. And in that conversation, she said, okay, let's imagine it actually happens. What happens first? What does Putin and Russia gain in the immediate aftermath of a full takeover of Ukraine? And of course, that's the ports in the Black Sea. That's Ukraine's military industrial complex, which has been developing hugely over the past couple of years. Ukraine's factories and all of its steel producers and metal producers that are major exporters to the world. The grain that is also exported to the world. And That one is actually easy to imagine, right? And what Russia would do with those resources, which is blackmail the world with them, because they've already done that. They did that with Europe and gas blackmail, and they blocked those very same ports at the beginning of the full-scale invasion and tried to blackmail and terrify the world with the threat of famine and not being able to get food to parts of the world that really need it. So that's really where I started, because it was, unfortunately, very possible to imagine. And because it's happened before, but also that's clearly what Russia would do, I think, in the immediate aftermath. And then we had to think of what would happen next. And one thing I really wanted to put in the piece was this idea that all of the Western assets that are in Ukraine, and it's not just the Western weapons or other things like that, there are major Western companies that have manufacturing plants here, offices here, operations here. All of that would belong to Russia if it took over. And the idea that they would somehow respect any of this property of Western companies that have supported Ukraine, have left Russia, is obviously a joke. They would immediately appropriate these things. And you can actually imagine it happening. It would roll out over the first few weeks and months and years. And then you get into kind of talking about Ukraine's resources and what it has. It possesses the largest reserves of lithium and mineral resources and other critical resources. And it has immense amounts of human capital. I mean, this is a very large country with lots of people who are very highly educated, and that's generations, right, that are going to be subject to Russian occupation and terror. And so it sounds really grim, and I wanted to make this point today, which even Francis, when we talked about the piece's idea, he said, I know this is a grim thing to even think about, but I just thought to myself after I finished writing it, yeah, it's terrifying to think of, but when I listed basically why Ukraine is such an impressive country economically and what it has to offer its own people and the world, I walked away from it like, wow, Ukraine is amazing, actually. It was a good reminder for myself too, in a way.
Well, thank you for that intro, Liliane. I think this is the right way of getting into this question for our purposes, I think. So in your overview of the Ukrainian economy from its industries, assets and to its people, where do you think it's at the moment relatively strong, but where do you think also it's weak?
Yeah, so to be completely honest, it's a bit hard to say where it's strong, but I don't want to be too negative. Ukrainian companies have remained resilient over the last couple of years. They're doing the best with what they have. They're exporting as much as possible. The IT sector, for example, has remained very strong because its business has always been 99% export oriented. What I mean is that 99% of the business that IT companies in Ukraine do is with companies abroad. It's outsourcing. A lot of Ukrainians have jobs as contractors with foreign companies, or they just work remotely for companies abroad. So they've been able to keep their job, they can keep spending money. So the economy has survived, and I would categorize it as it's surviving. And it almost seems sometimes like it is hanging on by a thread. And the main thing I think is that it's a bit weak everywhere. Like no matter what sector you look at, it's either gone. For example, I was just talking to someone the other day. This was really interesting. Like there's absolutely no business almost for lawyers. There's no business. There's no clients. So like some industries are just like basically non-existent or have very little business. And then, but everywhere you look, there's labor shortages. And it's a huge problem for Ukraine. And I think that's mainly because of mobilization. And interestingly, not just because people are being mobilized, men are being mobilized, they are, but also because men who would be mobilized are either hiding or they're taking work that is unofficial work. They're working only as contractors or places that will hire them kind of part-time and unofficially because they don't want to be on the books, right? They don't want to be registered as working somewhere and then the government can easily identify them. So companies are having a really hard time hiring people. And that's obviously a big problem, right? Because the less people you have working and contributing to the economy, obviously that has huge effects on the state to be able to generate taxes to then support the military effort. So I don't want to have this doom scenario, but it does feel a bit like things are very precarious. And actually, one example I can give of the labor shortages being felt even in a place like Kyiv, where when you're here in the capital, it seems like life has gone on, is that in the Kyiv metro, they have drastically reduced the number of subway trains. And during peak times, the time between trains is getting longer. So now in peak time, it's about 3 to 4 minutes. And during non-peak hours, it's about 6 to 7 minutes. And I know that, I don't know what it's like in London, but like I lived in New York, and like complaining about waiting for a subway train for 3 to 4 minutes that's a joke. You can't. Sometimes you're waiting 20 minutes, right? But in Kyiv, it was really normal to expect a train to come every 2 minutes. And so waiting 3 to 4 minutes during rush hour is a long time for people. And this weekend I was waiting for the train, and it took 7 minutes. And there's a timer actually in the Kyiv metro that shows you how much time has gone between each trains. And I saw a guy taking a picture of the 7 minutes, because it's like, this is really indicative of these changes that are happening. And so it seems like something small, just the metro trains. But if you take something like that and you realize that it's happening in every single sector across the entire economy, it's big.
That's, I think, a really interesting example. Just staying on mobilization then, how much of a drag on Ukraine's economy is this having? And do you think anything is going to change in the future? Any actions the government's either planning or taking right now that could change the situation or not?
It's really tough. So there was a really good article in Bloomberg, actually, just to plug it. I think people should definitely read it, about the labor shortages in Ukraine. And in there, it said that there's a 27% contraction in the available labor force from pre-war levels, which is almost 30%, right? It's a lot. And the issue isn't going to go away anytime soon. And I think the government, first of all, it has to mobilize people, right? It cannot not mobilize people into this war, or men, I should say men. You know, I mean, when I say people, women are partly women who are doctors and medical professionals, technically can't leave the country either, but men, right? And so it's interesting because there's not really much the government can do, and there's not even much that foreign partners can do, right? Even by giving foreign external financing, right? Because this is just a question of people. And the longer the war goes on, the more people will leave the country, whether that's women leaving or with their children, for example, or if it's men fleeing abroad illegally, or if it's people going into hiding, which is happening more and more now, or at least it's being talked about more in popular culture as mobilization starts up, or is in full swing again. And I don't really think anybody has a very good answer to this or solution to this. And I think one thing that companies are doing, of course, well, not even really doing themselves, is that they have to offer higher salaries because there's a shorter supply and they're competing over that shorter supply. And so wages are going up in Ukraine, which when you see these numbers, you think, oh, wages are going up. That's a good thing for people. But then you realize, no. The reason, though, is because it's like a race to get to people. And it's also bad for the companies, right? Because if the companies have to pay higher wages, they're going to have to cut costs somewhere else. They might have to cut production. And again, like this just reverberates throughout the entire economy. I think I answered your question.
No, absolutely. Thank you very much. Can we talk a little bit about one specific sector? I know you were writing about it last week, about the printing industry. And you were relating this, of course, to the awful strike on the printing shop in Kharkiv. Yeah,
so this strike, it's funny, I wrote about it in my business newsletter a couple weeks ago. And it was interesting because at an event about business in Kharkiv, this is before the strikes, they were saying that actually there were business leaders, and some of them were representatives of the publishing industry there in Kharkiv, which Kharkiv, you may know, and your readers and listeners may know, is like the publishing mecca of Ukraine. Huge printing presses there, publishing companies. They print most of the books that you buy in Ukraine, textbooks even. And there was this event, and the representatives were saying that actually the biggest threat to them as business people, as business owners, is not Russian attacks or the sort of danger of the war being that close to the front line and the border with Russia, but mobilization, because they can't attract enough people. People don't want to work officially, the things that I was already mentioning. And then, of course, a week later, Russia hits this printing press, which is the largest in Ukraine. And it's one of those things where you want to think that maybe they were aiming for something else and it missed and the missile hit the printing press, but it feels like it's so intentional, right? Because this hitting a printing press, of course, if you want to destroy a nation and its people, like destroying the things that it writes, is a target you probably want to hit if that's what your aim is and your goals, which is certainly what Russia's goals are, right? But it's also a hit to Kharkiv's economy, right? Because there's hundreds of thousands of books, millions of books are printed there every year. These are major publishing houses. And Ukraine has been experiencing a bit of a cultural renaissance as a result of the full-scale invasion, which I think the reasons of that are clear and obvious. And bookstores have been opening up all over the country. And the book industry, the publishing industry has been doing quite well. Of course, quite well relatively, right? But it was flourishing, all things considered, a flourishing sector. And taking out one of the largest printing presses is going to have a serious effect on that industry's ability to continue, to grow, to develop, to sell books. Not to mention the fact, like I said, there's textbooks being made in these printing houses. And it's such a clear, the symbology couldn't be clearer of what Russia's trying to do when it hits targets like this. But yeah, and it's going to take, the owners of the printing press have said it's going to take them at least 4 or 5 months to rebuild it, which that's probably optimistic. And so now you have the opportunity for hundreds of thousands of books that are not going to get printed over the next several months. And this is people who work in these industries who are now out of a job. And another thing they were saying is it's not easy to replace the people that have the expertise working in these printing presses. And this was something I hadn't really thought about, was that it's not, and it's really important, I think, to underline this, which is that in Ukraine, when people leave, you lose their expertise too, right? So if people are killed or if people go abroad, it's not that easy just to find someone that you can retrain tomorrow or in a week. And so in the publishing industry, these are very specific types of skills that people possess and that they spend years learning. And if they're killed in an attack or they're not able to go to their workplace and they decide to go work somewhere else or leave the country, you've lost that person. And it's going to take you a very long time, perhaps, to find a good replacement. So again, like I said, these things they have this immediate after effect, and then it lingers for years, if not decades.
Well, thank you, Liliane. Just to put some numbers to that, looking at your colleague Dominic Culverwell's article here, the aftermath of Russia's May the 23rd attack on Kharkiv's Faktor-Druk printing house destroyed over 50,000 books and printing equipment. It killed 7 employees and injured 22. The Factor Group's total damages from the attack are nearly €5 million. That's $5.4 million. Francis Dearnley, I know you have a few questions. Francis.
Thanks very much, Lynn. It was a real pleasure to read your essay when it arrived and a real privilege to commission it from you. Something that struck me when I read it, and I highly recommend that listeners do the same, there'll be a link in the show notes to this episode, was just the degree to which you emphasised if Russia were to take over large portions of Ukraine or indeed the whole country, just how much raw material in terms of minerals, but also the military industrial complex would then fall into Moscow's hands. And it made terrifying reading when you actually see some of the numbers on that. I just wondered if you could comment a little bit more for us on what the ramifications would be for the West if Russia suddenly got its hands on what Ukraine has.
Yeah, I think this is something that is understated just in the general public in general, basically because we don't know the full extent to Ukraine's impressive military industrial complex. We know a lot, but like I say in the piece, there's a lot of state secrets that, of course, are shared with Western countries that are key to Ukraine's success in this war that Russia would now possess. But just to go through some of those numbers, Ukraine has at least 200 domestic drone producers in the country. And that's aerial drones, but there's also the unmanned ground vehicles. They have also developed their own howitzer, the Bogdana. They've developed these extremely impressive sea drones, these naval drones that have taken out Russia's Black Sea fleet in the Black Sea. And the military doesn't love it when we say that they don't have a navy, because Ukraine's military technically does, but it doesn't have a big navy in the sense that we're used to with the Russian military, the U.S. military, or the other Western nations' militaries. It's a small division, but it's managed to develop these drones that are able to take out serious naval infrastructure and ships of the Russian Black Sea fleet. And of course, how they develop that technology, what that technology is very secret, but it's very important. It's clearly revolutionized the battlefield. And if Russia was to come and take over Ukraine, it would now possess all of these weapons, not the physical weapons themselves, right? But the technology and the plans for them, all of this intelligence that goes along with it. And the idea that Russia somehow wouldn't use that against NATO or wouldn't take advantage of this amazing military industrial complex that it's just gotten its hands on is ridiculous. It would immediately enjoy those spoils of war. So yeah, that part is, I think, really worth noting.
Liliane, hi, it's Dom here. If I could jump in, please. Thank you so much for joining us today. Can I talk about the kind of the support, financial support for Ukraine? If I get the numbers wrong, but I think the World Bank is supporting Ukraine to the tune of about $2 billion US dollars a month, paying for the civil service salaries and essential services to keep the country going. I mean, that is a huge amount of cash if we were scratching around the office. But actually, it's not a huge amount in world terms, or is it? I mean, for how long do you think the World Bank would be able to continue supporting Ukraine at its current rate? And just on that, I note the World Bank say it's going to cost, they reckon, about 480 billion US dollars for the recovery of Ukraine. But how does that compare to, as you were mentioning a moment ago, the flight of intellectual capital? Is that just have they put a number on the infrastructure that's been destroyed? Is that number reliable, basically? Thank you.
Yeah, that's another question it's a very good question, and it's scary to imagine. So Ukraine's finance ministry and central bank has basically said that for 2024, it'll need $37 billion in external financing for budget support, which works out to about $3 billion a month. And it basically feels that it has that covered. It says that it should have that covered because the World Bank and IMF financing and other financing from other foreign partners. So this year it seems to be covered, but nobody knows what next year looks like. Right? That's the sort of issue with this external financing, is that it's all based on, of course, political situations in countries. So if Trump is elected in the United States, what does that mean for 2025 for Ukraine for external financing? If institutions like the World Bank and others cannot pledge that much money every month, if other foreign partners decide, hey, this is going on too long, we can't continue to support the budget. Politically speaking, too, it might become divisive in other countries because already there are some voices in some Western countries that say, like, why are my tax dollars paying for pensions or teacher salaries in Ukraine? And that's why, actually, just one comment here, it's really important to push for seizing Russia's central bank assets in full for Ukraine, because that's money that can be easily given to Ukraine that isn't taking money from Western taxpayers, which some people have an issue with. But also, even if the Western taxpayer doesn't have an issue with that, why should they be the ones who are paying for it when these Russian central bank assets are just sitting there, frozen, and could be, if the political will was there, seized in full and given to Ukraine? And it's about $300 billion. And that would solve a lot of the issues, right? Both for Ukraine's battlefield needs and its budget needs. Of course, they have come through with this agreement that the windfall profits will be given to Ukraine as military aid, which is a good start, but again, not nearly enough of what Ukraine needs. And in terms of reconstruction, yeah, I think the World Bank's estimate of around 480 billion, they haven't updated that number for a while, and the destruction keeps coming. So that number, whenever I write about that number, I always say at least 480 billion and counting, because with each day, Ukraine is incurring costs to rebuild and reconstruct. And of course, it's hard to put a number on the loss of human capital. I think a way of thinking about it, look at the slow rate of development in Ukraine over the last 30 years, actually, since its independence. It suffered a lot from the flight of human capital, from brain drain, in other words. And that has certainly played a role in the slower than what was hoped rate of development in Ukraine. And so if you think about how now you have at least 6 million people who have left since the start of the full-scale invasion, many of whom will not come back. It's very unfortunate, but it's true. And that's going to lead to generations of lost potential. It's a fact. So it's hard to put a number on that, but I could say that it will be huge. And that's why attracting specialists back to Ukraine will be extremely important. And the government will have to prioritize that in some way, because a lack of specialists is something I didn't quite mention in full earlier when I was talking about the economic problems, but that's across the board. Speaking of reconstruction, the minister, Naim Mustafa, the other day was saying that basically the government just simply doesn't have enough project managers to carry out the projects that need to happen, from simple things like road construction to bigger reconstruction projects. And they can't compete because the salaries they can offer are quite low. And it's really tricky because if you just don't have the people with the know-how, it doesn't matter how much money comes in for reconstruction. Actually, you need the people here who know how to carry out these projects, who will carry them out earnestly. And if you don't have them here, that opens up the door and the opportunity for bad players to take advantage of these gaps for their own, financial gain. And I'm talking about people engaging in corruption and skimming off the top and engaging in shady deals and things like that. And so attracting people back, it's really hard to do now, but it will have to be a serious priority in the future.
Thanks. Now, you mentioned a moment ago about the seizing of Russian assets to keep the country going, pay for reconstruction and what have you. This is obviously a very loaded topic. Some commentators are saying that either take the assets, which is very problematic, take the interest, which is just a cash sum and a bit easier to handle. But others are saying, well, no, that would just fly in the face of the established system of global rules and norms, that by riding roughshod through that, it could do more damage than good to the overall system. Who would trust the West again if they were to do this here? Countries around the world who are slightly more murky than perhaps we'd like to be, might shy away from doing business. Where do you think the swingometer is on this argument at the moment? Is it just too poisonous to go near the seizing of assets? We hear a lot of good talk about it, but I haven't actually seen anything yet.
No, I know it's very divisive, and I know that across Europe, a lot of European leaders, and not sensible ones, I guess I was being a bit opinionated there, but like ones like Orban, for example, of course, he is against this. But I mean, even more responsible leaders have said that this could be a really bad precedent, right? And the Americans are a bit more, I would say, bullish on it, because to them, they have less assets in the United States, right? It's just really a European question. Fine. And so there has been very little movement on it because they cannot agree. And it's the same thing that happens on the battlefield. It's a fear of repercussions that don't actually come to be, right? So we don't want to give Ukraine X weapon because we're afraid of Russia's reaction. Months later, we give them the weapon, Russia has no reaction, right? So it's a similar kind of story that's playing out, I think, where it's just a fear of making a bold move. But in moments like this, we need bold moves. And I think you mentioned it's really interesting that this would be a flagrant violation of the norms that we have in our world if we just seized their money and gave it to another country. But it's Russia that has flagrantly violated international norms, right? And so a punishment for that is doing something to show the others that this is what will happen if you actually engage in this kind of behavior. And so I think it's interesting to me because it's the kind of moment that requires a leadership that is going to take these risky, bold moves. And you're seeing a lot of trepidation. And these arguments that Arab states and China will take their money out of the West, it's for at least the near future, it's not a possibility. There's nowhere else to put it. Let's just be honest, right? These are the strongest currencies in the world. And I know that Russia and China talk about dollar dominance and wanting to change that system and all of these things, but that's not going to happen, at least the foreseeable future. And so I'm a bit confused sometimes about the lack of movement, but I think it is just people and European leaders and other global leaders just being cautious. But again, 2.5 years into this war, we got to stop being cautious. Because while we're being cautious and weighing all the different options, Russia is continuing to just push as hard as it can into Ukraine and to totally ignore all international norms everywhere. So again, that's my personal view, but
thanks. And just finally, for me, I note that Ukraine's GDP growth is 3.2% this year, down from 5.3% last year. Now, okay, that's quite a drop, but equally, 3.2% this year. My God, we'd cry out for that in this country, and many, many others would as well, I'm sure. So can you just sort this out for me, please? That sounds like a good number, 3.2% GDP growth. I'm presuming a lot of that is to do with grain and that, therefore very vulnerable, but please correct me if I'm wrong there, which I probably am. But 3.2% growth, good, but overall the economy and the financial situation, not so good. So I'm just a bit confused with both sides of this. Please, can you help me out?
Yeah, Ukraine's growth for the last several years has been not great. It's been struggling a lot. So even doing a little bit better than before is something. But I think it's very difficult to explain, I think, even for me. But I think there's export growth. Like I was saying in the very beginning, there's a lot of companies that have managed to export a lot more. That's grain, that's metals. They are getting back to some pre-war levels of exports. And this has been helped on a lot by international partners who have been trying to finance exporting as much as possible, right? And also duty-free exports with the European Union. And this has helped a lot to get things out because, of course, the domestic market has essentially collapsed in Ukraine. It's still here, but in order to make money and to help the economy continue, you have to get exports out. So those exports going back to pre-war levels, almost reaching pre-war levels, is contributing to some of that growth. I think the external financing has helped keep the economy afloat. Banks are doing well in Ukraine. There's a lot of reasons for that. One is that, basically all the external financing goes through the banks. Soldiers have very high salaries, so that's also going into the banks. There's lots of deposits. Banks are state-owned, so like I said, the external financing is going there. So there are areas of the economy that are very stable or that are doing well, and that's what's contributing to those growth numbers. But it's, like I said, in each area that you look, there are issues that are kind of, if you peek under the hood a little bit, every industry is suffering in some way. But overall, and that's why these numbers show growth, the economy is chugging along. Let's say that.
Thank you so much, Dom, Francis and Liliane. Coming up, we have today's panel's final thoughts. Well, thank you very much, Dom, Francis and Liliane, for your time and your reporting today. Let's go to our final thoughts. Francis Dearnley, would you like to go first?
Well, thanks, David. I'll be very brief before I dash off to catch my train to Normandy. One of the other objectives I have whilst I'm here will be to connect with Ukrainian diaspora communities in the cities that I drive through with the charity Ukrainian Focus. So I'm very much looking forward to that. And if you are in any of the following places, Reims, Paris, or Munich, do reach out. I can't guarantee that I'll be able to see you, but I'm very keen to speak to people who left Ukraine as refugees and are currently living in those places. So do get in touch via the usual email. And then I will, of course, be also meeting up with Dom as well in Normandy. So I'll make sure I keep a bottle of Cidre on ice for you, Dom.
Thank you very much, Francis, and best of luck with your reporting trip. Dom Nicholls.
Yeah, thanks, David, and thanks, Francis. Look forward to seeing you there, although, of course, you better pronounce Himars correctly before you get there. It's not Reims. I landed my helicopter there on the way back from Bosnia, but that's another story. I just wanted to say I'm off for a few days, off tomorrow to Normandy for D-Day, so I'm not going to speak to you before then. But just, well, in particular to our US listeners, I'll be on Omaha Beach on the 6th. I'll be there carrying the set of compasses that my uncle had when although he was in the Royal Navy, he was driving an LCT, landing craft tank. He was attached to US forces. He drove it onto Omaha Beach repeatedly on the 6th of June. He lived to tell the tale, unlike many of your servicemen, many Allied servicemen, over 4,400 killed on D-Day alone. But yeah, I'll be on Omaha Beach on D-Day. I'll be thinking about the sacrifice of US and other Allied forces, and I'll speak to you all next week.
Well, thank you, Francis and Dom. Liliane, as our guest, would you like the very final words?
Thank you for having me on the podcast again. It was great. And I think one of the things that I want to emphasize is just that we talk a lot about supporting Ukraine and reconstruction even, and the amount that it will cost. But what we really need to be focusing on, I think, is giving Ukraine the resources to win the war. I'm actually going to the recovery conference in Berlin next week, and I can't stop thinking about why are we even talking about this now? It's important to keep the intention on that, to prepare for reconstruction when it happens, of course, but you help but think, but why aren't we talking about giving Ukraine all of the resources? And that means the military resources, the weapons it needs to win. And a good example, I think, of this is this partial ban on using weapons in Russian territory and only saying they can use them near Kharkiv, when, again, that kind of still ties the hands of Ukrainian soldiers to really beat Russia or to really inflict the type of damage on Russia's military that would be required to actually help Ukraine get on a path toward victory. So I think as the business editor, it's my job to think more about the economy and reconstruction and what's happening in Ukraine in that regard. But at the end of the day, it's all really about how do we get to a Ukrainian victory on the battlefield and ultimately Russia's loss, right?
Liliane, thank you so much for joining us. It's been really good to hear your thoughts, and best of luck with the conference next week. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the latest as soon as it is released, do refer to the podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the latest on your preferred podcast app. And, if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. And you can contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was produced by Rachel Porter, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.